They put his suitcase on the shoulder of the road and drove away without looking back. The asphalt smelled of hot tar, a stray dog barked twice, and an old man stayed sitting on the curb with his hat over his knees, like a relic the world had decided to leave behind. His name was Carlo Mancini. He was 74 years old, retired from a lifetime of fixing other people's problems in a small metal workshop, his hands still calloused from bending iron. He had 3 children who said they had places to be and reasons to hurry. They said the words without shame and left him with a thin sweater and a paper cup of lukewarm coffee. But what the children did not know was that Carlo kept a faded leather folder tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the attic, a folder with papers that mapped out a small orchard of land on the city's forgotten edge, a parcel that time and neglect had not erased. The sun pressed on his shoulders, the breeze carried dust into his throat, the taste of iron lingered when he bit his lip out of habit, and a secret older than the asphalt waited quietly for someone who would finally pay attention. What would make a son and a daughter unload their parents like trash at the side of a highway? Why would blood take that shape? What comes after humiliation when even the sound of a truck becomes an echo of rejection? Stay until the end. This is the story of how a hidden deed, a pension room, a man of the road, and an unlikely figure from a criminal underworld turned an abandoned life into a fight for justice and, oddly, a new kind of dignity. The first morning at the motel was a small theater of sensory details that marked humiliation. Dust layered the windows so that the sunlight came in like a muted accusation. Carlo woke with a throat that tasted of stale coffee and oil, his knees complaining as if they had been asked to perform decades of promises. He had the habit of straightening the edges of things, of folding shirts with the same careful motion he had used in his workshop. But here, the sheet had a cigarette burn and the pillow smelt faintly of soap used too thinly. His daughter Elena was the one who had spoken last before the car door slammed. She did not look back. Her voice had been clipped, efficient, almost clinical. Marco, the oldest, had kept his hands in the glove compartment like they belonged to someone else. Their words landed like coins on wet cement. They said they were tired. They said they could not take on the care. They said they were not prepared to be parents again. Inside the motel room, Carlo and his second wife Maria traded small sentences that were both apology and explanation. Maria ran a finger along the seam of his jacket to feel again the comfort of fabric against skin, and the smell of iron filings from his toolbox seemed to follow him like a trailing apology. There were 6 exchanges in that first dialogue, each one a small turning of a screw. Elena, you will be happier here. Carlo, I have nowhere else to go. Marco, it's easier for all of us. Maria, we can manage together. Elena, we are not coming back. Marco, we made a choice and it's final. At the end of that string of speech, Carlo sat on the edge of the bed and felt the mattress give under him like an old story finally giving way. The motel radio whispered a weather report, and in the bathroom, the sink tapped like a metronome counting the time they had left. Sensory notes piled up, the sticky feel of the motel chair, the bright glare of a neon sign outside, the metallic taste of worry, the soft cushion of Maria's hand, the distant smell of frying oil from the diner across the street. After the bump of that departure came the long, empty space where pride had been. The abandonment scene on the road needed to be lived twice, in sound and in details. The kids had packed the trunk in silence, but for the rustle of plastic and the crack of a mat folding. They left 2 suitcases and a plastic bag that held what women call essentials and men call nothing. Maria called out once, not to be cruel, but because it had become a habit to ask for closure, and Elena rolled down her window, as if sound could be a barrier. The family can't be a burden, she said, her voice deliberate. The car became a rectangle moving away, the sunlight catching the chrome and erasing faces. Carlo touched the leather folder at his side without thinking, palms dry, feeling the grain beneath his fingers. Dust rose in the wake of the car and settled into his shoes like an accusation. A bus idled, the driver slapped the steering wheel and wiped his hands on his pants, and someone named Josue saw them and slowed. Josue was a truck driver who had spent too many nights on highways and too many afternoons watching people pass like weather. He had a beer belly, a faded cap, and eyes that did not judge easily. He stopped, climbed down with slow movements, and offered a spare sandwich and a cigarette. There were 4 people in the neighborhood who would later be named in townsfolk whispers. Donna Lucia, who ran the small pension at the end of Loma Street, Father Mateo, who kept more than prayers for people who fell between cracks, Inspector Alvarez, who worked the tiny police station and kept a folder for stray cases, and Bruno the bartender, who gave shelter to stories in exchange for small favors. The dialogue here between Carlo and Josue expanded into 6 solid exchanges as they talked about work, about pride, about the leather folder, about why someone keeps paper when there is little left to keep. The scene layered senses again. The grit of the road in Carlo's teeth, the taste of warm bread Josue passed to him, the sound of a distant honk like a punctuation, the smell of diesel from Josue's rig, the prick of sun on the scalp where hair had thinned. The moment built tension because abandonment was not only physical loss, it was the theft of belonging. They went to the pension at the edge of town, where Donna Lucia met them at the door with a cloth on her hand and a look like a lighthouse for small vessels. The pension smelled of frying garlic, of coffee grounds and lemon cleaner, and its wooden floors creaked like a record of many arrivals. Donna Lucia spoke in quick, practical sentences and then in softer ones, as if she allocated generosity the way she allocated jam at breakfast. At the table that first night, there were conversations that stitched the strangers together. Father Mateo sat with his coat collar turned up, his voice low and precise. Bruno came to deliver a pot of stew and lingered long enough to offer an extra blanket. Inspector Alvarez dropped by to check that the abandoned were alive and not merely misplaced. Sophia, who lived next door and worked at the municipal office, brought an envelope of coupons that could pay for a month at the pension. Each person had a role, and each role came with sensory memories. The warm pressure of a bowl, the clinking of spoons, the soft thud of Lucia's hand on a chair as she explained the rules, the faint perfume of Sophia's scarf, the metallic rattle of coins when Bruno paid. The dialogue now needed to lengthen into 6 to 8 exchanges in order to show how a community formed around someone who had been thrown away. Lucia, are you sure you have nothing else, Carlo? Just this folder. Maria, we will stay here until we understand. Lucia, you are welcome. Bruno, if you need work, I can ask around. Sophia, I will help with paperwork. Father Mateo, there is dignity in asking for help. Carlo, I am not used to it. The conversation wound like thread through a patchwork blanket. The promise of shelter was small, but it mattered. At the center of the story came the folder, and with it the discovery that pushed the quiet into a legal and financial storm. One night, with the rain tapping a slow rhythm on the pension's roof, Carlo opened the leather folder and slid out a stack of brittle pages. A map with a compass faded by sun and handwritten notes in an old script. The map traced a triangular parcel on the outskirts of the city, a place that once had lemon trees that small stone wall, a land that had been parceled out in an era of different fortunes. In that folder was a deed from decades ago, a formal title that showed the land in Carlo's family name, a certificate of transfer, and a crop receipt from long ago that proved the plot was actively used when records were foggier. The technical explanation that would later guide meetings at the registry office had to be clear. The paper trail proved long-term occupation and a chain of possession that could be verified through notarized receipts and tax stamps. The legal route available in this jurisdiction was adverse possession, known in local terms as usucapio, a process where someone who has held, cultivated, and paid municipal taxes over a long period can claim legal ownership when formal title is missing or contested. The process required sworn statements, certified copies of old tax receipts, inspections by municipal surveyors, and a filing at the civil registry. A competent attorney would gather evidence, file a claim, notify interested parties, and wait for a judicial review. This procedural outline, explained plainly, would later form the backbone of the fight that turned paper into leverage. The backstory of Carlo fit into these documents, and it fit also into the people who remembered. The legalization sequence in the narrative described the steps in accessible terms and gave the procedural credibility the audience needed to believe that a brittle deed could become the center of a life-changing negotiation. Carlo's backstory unfolded in quiet paragraphs that explained why the folder existed and why he had clung to it like a life preserver. He had been a young immigrant who came to this region when the factories still hummed and the city had room for hands that could make things. He learned to read metal, to know the grain of a bolt by feel, and to trade honest labor for a roof. He married Maria when they were both under 25, and they scraped together enough for a small down payment on a patch of land at the edge of the city. For years they planted citrus and sold crates at the market, and the orchard became their savings account in leaves. The second paragraph recounted a decade when rain failed and buyers vanished, and they were forced to accept cash offers that seemed small then but were the only way to keep food on the table. They signed transfer notes under pressure, but Carlo kept an old copy tucked into the leather folder because he had a stubborn belief that records mattered and that paper could hold memory. The third paragraph told of Carlo's workshop years, where he fixed stoves and calmed machines, where his hands earned him a reputation for patching things no one else could fix. He had taught local kids to use tools, and he paid what he could in tax receipts, leaving a paper trail that others later would dismiss. The fourth paragraphs admitted the small regrets he carried like small scars, the way a man carries a scar under his shirt. A decision to sell a small piece of land that later traded hands into silence. Those paragraphs together amounted to the kind of backstory that grounded the legal claim in years of honest work, community memory, and a stubborn practice of keeping paper, even when it was inconvenient. This backstory filled the necessary space to show motive and history, and it explained why a folder under a floorboard was not a relic but a lifeline. Tension arrived in waves, and the story required 3 big moments where pressure ratcheted up and characters had to choose. The first moment of tension came when a representative from a construction company arrived asking to buy the parcel. He wore pressed clothes, a precise smile, and a leather folder of his own. The town's older men gathered at Bruno's bar and whispered that new development would mean money. There were 3 paragraphs of cobbled conversation, escalations, and suspicion. The second moment of tension built when Carlo's children heard of the land's value and returned, not with guilt, but with appetites, each asking for their share and claiming caring had been the plan all along. The third moment of tension seethed when the Mafia boss entered the frame, his presence impossible to ignore and morally complicated. He was a man known in the city by the name Don Rocco, a figure whose wealth moved like a shadow across the urban map. He first appeared not as a threat, but as a patron at Lucia's dinner table, a man who admired workers and who was amused by obstacles. Don Rocco had a soft voice and the way of paying for things that smelled like both kindness and danger. At each of those points, the narrative deepened with sensory detail to keep the reader viscerally present. The crisp scrape of paper during the deal, the metallic clink of coins when an offer was made, the heavy perfume in Don Rocco's car, the hollow sound of Carlo's name when his children said it as if testing a temperature. Moment 1 of tension was compact and sharp. A suit named Raphael represented a construction firm that wanted to buy the land for a new condominium complex. He offered an amount that would change Carlo's life and the town's map. Raphael: we can pay you 3 times what anyone else would. Carlo: I do not know how to accept so much money. Lucia: it could fix the pension for years. Raphael: imagine a new road, imagine jobs here. Maria: we need to think. Raphael: the offer was a mirror, and the punch came when the firm's contract contained clauses that would strip resident rights and erase communal use. Senses tightened. The paper smelled faintly of printer ink. The light in the office made everyone squint. The coffee Raphael served was too bitter. The handshake felt slick and rehearsed. The air left something metallic in the mouth at the thought of what selling truly meant. This moment lasted enough for doubt to grow roots, and for Carlo to ask for time. Moment 2 of tension arrived when Elena and Marco reappeared at the pension, bringing a lawyer and a list of demands. They spoke in voices that were both familiar and alien. Elena: "We tried to call. We wanted to be involved." Marco: "You should not sign anything until we see it." Maria: "You left us at the road. We need to protect them." Lawyer: "We will need documents and signatures." They pushed, and Carlo felt the old hurt ignite like kindling. He tasted salt when Elena spoke as if every word contained vinegar. The mattress swayed when voices rose. The smell of cheap perfume mingled with the stew Lucia had warmed. The barometric pressure in the room seemed to drop. People in the pension looked away, but Father Matteo's hands stayed on Carlo's shoulder. The legal stakes were no longer abstract. They had to litigate against complaint and against old resentments, and each question about motive echoed through the small dining room. Moment 3 of tension was the arrival of Don Rocco. He appeared with a small entourage and a smile that weighed heavily. He did not announce himself as a mafia boss. He talked about respect for labor and about wanting to invest in neighborhoods. Most of the town had seen him at funerals and festivals, but never like this. Don Rocco offered a path that blurred legal and extra-legal lines. He could make the registry move faster. He could offer Carlo a stipend. He could ensure Marco and Elena got a sum that would make them go away. The moral calculus was compressed into short breaths. Don Rocco: "You should not worry about paperwork. Leave that to me." Carlo: "I need to know who will live there." Don Rocco: "We will build apartments for the city and honor the memory of families." Carlo: "I do not want trouble." Don Rocco: "Trouble is expensive." The room smelled of cologne that cut like lemon. The chrome on his car flashed in the pension window. The wooden table felt rough under fingers that wanted to sign. But the sound of a clock seemed to accelerate, and everyone felt the time to decide had shortened. The legal process that followed was messy and slow, but plausible. An attorney named Dr. Renato volunteered to work on Carlo's claim without immediate payment, because he had been taught by his own mother the practice of mercy. Dr. Renato gathered the brittle tax receipts, commissioned a surveyor named Miguel to map the old borders, and filed a petition for adverse possession at the civil registry. Notices were posted, a public hearing scheduled, and the construction company countered with a title search and a chain of custody argument. The steps were listed and: assemble documentation, obtain affidavits from neighbors, hire a certified surveyor, file for judicial recognition, and await a court ruling. The process required patience and proof, but it was not a fairy tale. Town meetings were held, records were dug from dusty municipal drawers, and witnesses were called. Names mattered. Inspector Alvarez pulled a file and found a tax receipt in the name of Carlo's wife, Maria, dated 30 years before. Sofia tracked down an old vendor who confirmed the orchard in a notarized note. Each corroboration tightened the chain and made the claim stronger. Don Rocco's interest complicated the legal path in ways that raised ethical questions. He offered to buy the parcel for more than Raphael's offer, but with an alternative plan. He said he would preserve part of the land for the pension, fund a small community hall, and ensure the Mancini name remains on a plaque if Carlo agreed. To most townspeople, it seemed like a generous solution. To Dr. Renato and to Father Matteo, it raised red flags. There was a negotiation room scene where 6 to 8 exchanges of dialogue took place and where every gesture counted. Carlo sat heavy as if each word were a weight. Elena bargained with tears. Marco argued logistics. Don Rocco spoke with tender certainty. Raphael looked from the corner like a shark waiting to see which tide prevailed. Lucia folded cloth over sorrow and hope. Dr. Renato asked for legal guarantees. The smell of paper signed in that room was rich with ink and intent. The sound of a pen scratching was like a verdict being formed in slow motion. When the contest reached its peak, the children's motives became clear. Some returned out of shame, some out of greed, and some out of a desire to mend. Elena wanted to open a small bakery with a guaranteed loan. Marco wanted to invest in a business he had dreamed of. They confronted Carlo in a final scene that acted as moral crucible. They each spoke, and at least 6 exchanges took place where accusations and confessions moved like the tide. Elena, we had reasons. We could not care for you. Marco, you sold yourself short and we had to survive. Carlo, I never asked for your money. Maria, we survived on what we had. Elena, you could have told us. Carlo, I did not want you to feel obligated. Marco, you abandoned us once when we needed you, and now you expect us to come back. The sensory backdrop was stark. The kitchen light hummed, the kettle whistled, the taste of overboiled tea seemed bitter, the fingers of the old man trembled as he pushed the letter across the table, and outside the rain began in soft, steady drops. Carlo's final decision surprised almost everyone. He refused to sell to Raphael, who wanted a full commercial change. He refused to sign away the parcel to Don Rocco without ironclad legal guarantees and independent oversight. Instead, he made a choice that reflected the dignity he had held even in poverty. With advice from Dr. Renato, he proposed a third road: transfer a partial development trust that would guarantee a community wing, fund pensions for residents in Lucia's home, and set aside a small fund for youth apprenticeships that would honor his years in the workshop. The trust would be legally binding, with a board composed of community members including Sophia, Inspector Alvarez, Father Mateo, and an independent municipal trustee named Rosa. The proposal required signatures and money enough to buy out opportunists and to ensure the parcel was used as a mixed community project. Don Rocco scowled, then smiled and agreed to match funds, but only under conditions that made everyone nervous. Marco and Elena signed with hesitation and with the visible calculation of people who were weighing dignity against immediate need. The scene of signing filled the room with the rustle of papers, the squeak of chairs, the metallic click of a seal, the taste of relief and salt, the smell of rain on concrete. The climax resolved in both legal and social terms. The court recognized the chain of possession after the surveyor's report and the affidavits of neighbors confirmed long occupancy and tax payments. The construction firm pulled back under public scrutiny. Don Rocco remained involved, but the trust structure limited unilateral control and required transparent accounts audited by the municipality. A portion of the proceeds went to refurbish Lucia's pension and to create a small community center where Carlo's name was placed on a plaque. The project hired local youth for construction and also created an apprenticeship fund in metalworking named after Carlo. His children received a fair monetary settlement, but not the total they had hoped for. Some accepted and stayed, others left. The confrontations led to repair in some relationships, but not all. Justice looked less like punishment and more like redistribution with guardrails. The town felt the tremor of money arriving and also the calmer hum of a community that had been asked to choose who mattered. The epilogue came in 3 temporal beats and showed the consequences in human scale. 1 month later, Carlo had a new routine. He took small walks to the corner where Bruno's bar stood, drank weak coffee with Sophia and Father Mateo, and visited the pension each morning to watch the workers measure and sweep the old garden that would become the community plot. He learned the names of teenagers who would become apprentices, and he taught the first class on metal shaping, his voice proud and small. The pension smelled of fresh paints and lemon oil, and Lucia cooked extra soup every Tuesday. Don Rocco visited once with a basket of fruits and left a look that suggested he was rethinking the shape of investments when tied to public oversight. Some of Carlo's neighbors whispered that luck had turned, but Carlo said little. He preferred to show by steady work rather than speech. The town's mood had shifted. People said good things about the Mancini project in the market, and the construction workers began to joke with the pension guests. The first month ended with a small celebration where a plaque bearing Carlo's name was affixed to the community hall, and he pressed his palm to cool metal as if sealing a fate he had not expected. 3 months later, the community center opened officially. The trust had been ratified, the auditors had published the first report, and there was a small council that included Lucia, Father Matteo, and the neutral trustee from the municipal office named Rosa. The apprenticeship program had placed 2 young men in paid positions, and a small scholarship fund had been created in memory of Maria. Carlo's children were more present in public life, and some had started to volunteer shifts at the center, though the emotional distance remained. Don Rocco's contributions were transparent and channeled through a legal foundation that had municipal oversight and civil society participation. The city praised the model in a small press release, and the local paper ran a feature that described the project as a case where community, law, and unexpected financiers had reached an uneasy but workable truce. Carlo visited classrooms and showed students how to cut metal and bend it with heat and patience. He smelled of coal dust and paint, and he threw back his head and laughed once when a young apprentice finally coaxed a stubborn bolt into alignment. 6 months later, the project had begun to show real social returns. The community garden yielded vegetables used in the pension kitchen and shared with elderly residents on fixed incomes. The apprenticeship program had expanded to 4 trades, and one of the youngsters found a full-time job with a regional firm. The pension had been renovated fully and included a small visitor room where families could meet without feeling like they were intruding. The municipal council voted to replicate the trust model in another district, and the mayor mentioned the Mancini case in a speech about civic innovation. Some of Carlo's children had reconciled moderately, offering help without the entitlement they once displayed, while others remained estranged. Don Rocco's profile in the city had shifted from a behind-the-scenes power broker to a public donor whose motives were always questioned, but whose funds could no longer operate unchecked. The lasting change was less about the money and more about dignity restored. Carlo worked a few days a week teaching, and the rest of the time he sat beneath a young lemon tree planted in the center yard. He touched its leaves with a look that suggested he had finally been able to plant something other than worry. The town had gained a hall, a model, and a story that would be told when someone asked what dignity looks like in action. If you are feeling angry or moved by what happened here, you are not alone. This story forces uncomfortable questions about family obligation, about what happens when society's safety nets are thin, and about whether help from questionable sources can ever be redeemed by transparent structures. Tell us in the comments what you would have done if you were in Carlo's shoes. Would you have sold to the highest bidder? Would you have trusted a man like Don Rocco? Would you have chosen community over immediate security? Right, I would have stayed or I would have sold, and explain why. Your choice would matter to others. Your comment might give courage to someone in a hard place and help them see options they did not imagine. Speaking out builds a community of people who refuse to let abandonment become silence. In the end, the lesson that Carlo's small life offered to the town was blunt and tender at once. He had been abandoned and then found again by choices that were messy and imperfect. Justice in this case did not mean punishment alone. It meant creating institutions that restrained power and that spread opportunity. A piece of land turned into a place where skills could be taught, where a pension was saved, where laughter returned to a table. If this story moved you, consider subscribing to follow more narratives like this, where people find ways to protect dignity, where law and community act together, and where a single folder of old paper can become a bridge. Remember that family is not only the people who share your blood, but the people who show up when everything else has been taken away.